I love seeing animators do cool things with the medium that other people weren't necessarily trying.
Like to see a picture of my kids?
The 60s. Hard times, heavy times. Welcome to the Bomb Squad podcast. With me, I have...
Hi, I'm Austin Zwiebelman.
Hi, I am Tim M. Sullivan.
And I'm Ethan Hawker, hosting today's podcast on Fritz The Cat, the 1972 X-rated animated feature from Ralph Bakshi. First, before I get into the history and everything, I think I will actually ask you guys a two-part question. What is your history with animated furry pornography, and what were your expectations going into the film? Who am I going to throw under the bus first? Austin.
In my lifetime, furry porn manifested in the form of mostly Newgrounds Flash animations about Sonic the Hedgehog characters. Then later, after 2016, Disney's Zootopia really breathed new life into the community. Personally, I'm not turned on by it, but I think I'm at the point in my life where I don't think it's an inherently harmful fetish. I've grown in that way. That's my character arc with that specific type of pornography. Expectations for Fritz the Cat. I expected it to look kind of like every other Western adult animated film at the time. You think of like Tarzoon, Shame of the Jungle, The Missing Link, like X videos, Google vintage animated porn, disgusting movies that I associate with unpleasant smells, juvenile takes on sex and sensuality, an impromptu trip to boob world at some point. But beyond the look of the film, I was kind of excited to see the hot takes lampooning 1960s social archetypes. I've always believed that lots of the things people in the 60s were fighting for are still being fought for today. So while I was certain that this would inform me of how society used to be, I was also curious if there were going to be any jokes or takes in this that stood the test of time. Back to you.
That's fair. I feel like Tarzoon and Down and Dirty Duck and all that are particularly hard to go back to. And they're sort of what you think of when you think of cheapo exploitation, adult animated films. But Fritz certainly fits into that archetype a little bit. There's some roughness, but it looks a lot more polished than you would necessarily think. Tim.
So I was going to do a bit on the first part of that question, but Austin basically took my answer verbatim. So I do have a bit of a history with Fritz. I was one of those people who in high school tried to find very edgy, controversial stuff. And there's a period where I was just scouring IMDb every day just to find different film things that I didn't know about. And so Fritz the Cat was one of those movies that came across my radar when I was just looking up X-rated movies, and found out that it was commonly referred to as the first X-rated animated film, which is not correct.
What?
The first one is actually 1001 Nights, I believe.
That's a contentious point. So Fritz is the first one to ever be rated X by the MPAA for the United States, but Cleopatra was given a self-ascribed X rating when it was released over here as Cleopatra, Queen of Sex, which is, for those who don't know, 1001 Nights and Cleopatra are both Mushi Productions adult animated films from 1969, nice, and 1970, respectively.
But yeah, it was one of those movies that came across my radar when I was looking into all that kind of stuff. And so I remember checking it out. I think it was my senior year of high school. I looked into it and I watched the first 10 or so minutes, and once I got to the bathtub orgy, I was I don't know if this is for me. So I kind of dropped off and then revisited it a year or two ago whenever it landed on Prime, and finally revisited it. And there's some parts of it that I enjoyed, some parts that didn't quite land with me, but we'll get more into that later. Back to you, Ethan.
That opening can kind of particularly turn people off. It's probably the most puerile the film gets. It's the one that's probably, just off-putting, I guess, in a lot of respects. It lacks some of the introspection of later parts, some of the more interesting ideas. But it's got some funny bits. I like it. Part one of that question, when I was a young man, I played a little game called Sonic Adventure 2 Battle, and it ruined my life.
Yeah, woo, she's sexy and smooth.
As for the second part, my expectations going into the film, well, the first thing I actually ever had of Ralph Bakshi was the Cool World soundtrack, which was given to my mother by my uncle for no reason. My mom had no interest in Cool World. She'd never seen the film. She would hate it if she had, I'm sure, because it's not very good.
I love Who Framed Roger Rabbit.
Yeah, that's a good one. I love evil tunes. My first exposure to Ralph Bakshi was with the 1977 film Wizards, which of course references Fritz the Cat with the they killed Fritz, those lousy stinking yellow fairies, etc., etc. And that sort of introduced me to the idea that, oh wait, outside of anime, Western cartoons can be made for adults. That's pretty neat. I kind of looked into Bakshi's filmography further from there, particularly Heavy Traffic, which was a birthday gift for my 15th birthday from my mom, who didn't know any better. I didn't tell her what it was about, and I loved it. But it took me a long time to get to Fritz because I'd read about it, and despite like its significance, I'd also read that it was like a lot more dumb, basically. It was like, oh, this is just Heavy Traffic, but worse. And at the time, I was, 15. I didn't watch it for a little bit until I was really, I think, a sophomore in high school, and I liked it a lot. It took some growing initially. Revisiting it, I liked it more and more, like every time I saw it, just because like it's not as good as Heavy Traffic. It's not nearly as thoughtful or good, but it's better entertainment, I guess. It's funnier in that it makes me laugh sometimes. It has sort of a dry sense of humor that I appreciate, but like going into it that first time, I was like sort of mixed. Like I wasn't sure what to expect despite my love of this director, but it was a pleasant time, and it's one that I enjoy more and more as my historical understanding broadens, because this film is really important. Just sort of going into a brief background of it, because Ralph Bakshi had previously only directed television animation like Rocket Robin Hood and Spider-Man, which is why there's a brief scene in this where somebody refers to a character as Uncle Ben, which I like. I'm 90% sure that's an intentional homage, because the first episode Bakshi directed was the origin of Spider-Man for season 2. It's a good ep. It's a good ep. I'm not gonna lie.
Your Uncle Ben has been shot. Murdered.
Uncle Ben? Dead? No.
But this film from 1972, building on like the popularity of underground comics and the Beatles' Yellow Submarine, sort of establishing that you could sell cartoons to adults. Fritz was a huge hit. Like the numbers on how much it made are weird and scattered. Like some people say 5 million, some say 90 million. Either way, it made several times its budget, and it was made by a lot of creatives with a lot of hot. Unlike that sounded more like Walken than Bakshi. I swear I can do a good one. Just a lot of really cool creatives getting together and making this movie in New York, and then suddenly having to move production to California halfway through, which is such a mess. And the final product kind of shows it, but the fact that it was made at all is incredible. And that's sort of a long, rambling answer to it, to my own question that I asked myself. But no, for you guys, what were your overall thoughts on the film as sort of a part one? And then what did you think about the ending, especially, Tim?
So yeah, I guess overall thoughts on the film. I do enjoy it after having given it a second and third chance. I don't think it's his strongest work, but I do kind of I see it as sort of like a blueprint for what Bakshi would end up becoming. And I really love a lot of his later works. Like American Pop is just such a fucking awesome movie. And I really enjoy Wizards. I really enjoy Fire and Ice. Cool World is one that exists. I do think it has a lot going for it, particularly given its time. It's very much a standout movie. I think it has some funny humor. One particular just one-off line that always gets me is when he's just standing up on the car talking to all the crows, and then just you hear some guy go, "Get the fuck off my car."
Bosses, they ride around in limousines.
Get the fuck off my car!
Bosses, they're
I don't know what it is about that line, but it's so funny to me. I think another thing that was an initial put off to me was in the first couple minutes you see Fritz as just this kind of Holden Caulfield wannabe guy, and I had just read Catcher in the Rye a year or two ago, and it's oh, fuck off. But I think watching it now and watching it all the way through, I have this greater appreciation of it's kind of lampooning that. It's kind of just making him look like a dumbass and a narcissist.
We shall overcome!
overall solid, and I guess my thoughts on the ending. I don't have anything too especially deep to say about the ending, but like I think it's fun, just like the end reveal that he's alive and he's still horny. Like that's funny to me. So I guess that's basically the gist of what I've got. Back to you, Ethan.
That's interesting. I mean, I definitely agree with the points about liking Bakshi's Fantasy Fair, and American Pop is so good. It's dying for a Blu-ray release. We need more than just the American Pop Cowboy Bebop the movie double feature DVD, which it exists for some reason.
We need the American Pop Cowboy Bebop double feature Blu-ray, because neither of those have a good Blu-ray that's widely available.
Yes, that's how we fix this. That's how we win. The ending, I think that's an interesting take too. I might disagree with that, but there is something to be said about it as like not being a downer too, I think, considering the rest of the tone of the film.
Yeah.
For sure. Austin, overall thoughts, things that stood out, and opinions on that ending.
You just want to put the Clockwork Orange, I was cured, over the ending of him bouncing around the hospital room. There was a Salinger-influenced cat jerk in the Rye cut of this where he just says phonies a lot.
God, the place is crawling with phonies.
I think that the opening scene, like right off the bat, sums up what you get with almost this whole movie. These construction workers having a conversation that sounds straight out of real life. They're discussing the rift that forms when people who lived like Christian, blue-collar lives, when they send their kids to college and watch them become these high-minded idealists out of nowhere. And the animation heightens the whole experience. They pick their ears, they're spurting out like a comical amount of hot sauce on their lunch. It makes them look like grotesque and stupid. That's the rubric for the whole film. Everybody's made to look kind of grotesque and stupid while they engage in these familiar, everyday interactions. But then one of them goes over to take a piss, and you get the second ingredient for this stew. When the movie's not doing satire, it's existing just to show you cartoons doing X-rated things. And I think sometimes the balance tips a little bit to one side. For every scene that you have making fun of how hippies have conformist attitudes about stuff, you have this drawn-out orgy that's just about the raunchy sex. For every scene about, like, white people reducing the black struggle to an academic curiosity, you have Fritz getting uber-baked and chasing someone through a junkyard trying to hump them. Like, this movie has bits that still work fine. Gags about police brutality and academia and revolution, but they're almost weighed down by these moments of shock value, which mysteriously aren't as well written. And as for the ending, I think it's absolutely hilarious how bad they played that hand. Like, trying to get an emotional moment out of Fritz after a whole movie of him being like a self-centered douche just makes you wonder if like production interpreted the material they were making like normal people would. It's not exactly how I'd write it, and the moment felt a little flat for me. As much as I was excited to see our boy was okay, there's like a cheap novelty to the vulgarity in this movie, but Fritz is much more exciting to me when it's doing observational comedy.
Yeah, I think that's completely fair. I think the observational comedy is what stands out. The sex stuff is like a draw. Like, I feel like that's the stuff where you're going to get butts in seats, kind of, in a way, especially in 72, when that was a big draw for a lot of that particular audience of like college students and horny weirdos and that sort of thing.
Yeah, I specifically remember at one point in class, Pete was talking about The Godfather, and he's like, the two big movies that came out the year The Godfather came out were Fritz the Cat, X-rated cartoon, and Behind the Green Door, straight up porn.
I fucking love Beyond the Green Door. I love that factoid every time Pete says it.
Yeah, the early 70s were a really good time if you wanted to have like really financially successful pornography, which
takes back.
Yeah, and I guess this is sort of a belated disclaimer, but I would not classify Fritz as porn, really. Sex happens in it, but I don't think it ever strives for eroticism. But for my overall thoughts on it, I think it's good. I think it's a lopsided good. It's less than the sum of its parts. You can read my thoughts on it at zeekfilm.com.org/. I'll just put a link. I do writing work, and I wrote reviews of this film, and also Cleopatra and 1001 Nights, and also this film's terrible sequel, which sucks and is bad, and I hate it. Nah. But no, the moments of like it is very much weighed down by like the weird kind of sex scene stuff, and that ending. God, I'll discuss that in a second though. But there are so many genuinely funny scenes. I really like the sequence in the synagogue I love Fritz burning down the university. Like he has this very self-centered sort of tirade, and then when he sees the actual consequences of his action, it's just sort of him like meekly like, I'll get a blanket. The blanket's on fire. I love that line. My parents are gonna kill me. That kind of shit. It's very, very good when it's a bit more dry like that, I think. The stuff with the crows is overall, I think, handled pretty elegantly, all things considered. It tends to place the impetus on the police, like doing violence, and like I feel like the crows are the only sympathetic characters in the film, really. Everyone else is kind of shrewish or just mean or a Nazi or a cop.
What's the difference?
Yeah, there we go. Duke in particular. This movie does have a women problem, which is probably like the most consistent thing in Bakshi's filmography. That's the most frustrating. But despite that, I think it's slightly mitigated on some level, again, by the fact that everyone overall is pretty unlikable, aside from some of the crows, and particularly Duke. God bless Duke. Duke's death it's really a herald of things to come with like poetic Bakshi, with stuff like you get in Heavy Traffic. There are some genuinely poetic sequences, particularly like Ida leaving the bar, leaving the club as she remembers her childhood, which was a sequence I love, or like the Malcolm the Cockroach from Coonskin. But then the last third of it, basically as soon as he leaves the city, not as good. Like it starts getting worse, and then he leaves Winston, and then it's mostly just bad, or like pretty uneven. There's one really great shot of a tear zooming out, like you see sort of the like crosses reflected in a tear. So gorgeous. I love that shot to death. And then the big explosion far out, which it was supposed to end there, of course, but his producer, Stephen Krantz, said, hey, give it a happy ending. And Bakshi tended to kind of fold to like producer mandates like that more often than you'd think for a relatively iconoclastic director. Then we got the ending we got, which it's not satisfying. Like, I feel like Fritz should die because he's awful and I hate him. He's a bad person. And like, I think the sort of perfect demise for him is sort of muttering about how this is terrible, I'm going to do the right thing, as he does the exact wrong thing, is sort of the perfect encapsulation of his character. So having him win, quote unquote, at the end, I was like, that doesn't track. And then it left it more than anything, it left the door open for a terrible, awful sequel, which that's the real reason they should have killed Fritz.
They didn't kill Fritz.
They didn't kill Fritz. There's a lot to like in the film, even if like a lot of Bakshi's films, it doesn't quite achieve that poetic pacing of them, but it still has that hodgy-podginess of awkwardness where all the stories are sort of segmented in a way that doesn't quite work as well as it does in later works, I should say. But moving on to not just, the film's narrative elements and comedy, the aesthetics, sort of like what Austin brought up from the start. How do you feel the aesthetic holds together? Like, there is a certain lack of cohesion, I think, sometimes, at least in terms of quality control, but it is certainly distinct with its underground comics visual style and eclectic, let's be more charitable, eclectic animation and layouts, and its distinctive soundtrack. So what did you think about those elements, Austin?
I really think that Fritz holds together, the animation specifically. That's a big time yes for me on does the animation hold together. The backgrounds do a spectacular job of capturing the way New York City used to be a huge, surreal sewer, like a gross Sodom and Gomorrah-esque hell. The anthropomorphic character design also lets you know so much about like how they're trying to depict people within the jokey situations. Although it's obligatory to state that the crows are likely to be read as a type of blackface these days, most of these designs just like turbocharge the satire. Like you have these evil ANCAPs who are depicted as these tiny animals that normally scurry away from people, and they just brutally assault a giant loving horse. Like, it just lights up that LSD part of your brain. And man, those establishing shots where it's like the city's drawn to mimic like fisheye lenses, what a gimmick! I haven't seen that. And the rainbow gel overlays and the sort of rainbow airbrush background mats like you get with the rabbis on the couch, that was far out. Like for a movie where I've heard there were animators protesting production because they thought it was smut, I gotta say, like, Fritz's animation is really stellar for being the first adult animation out of the gate in America after the Hays Code. I really think that part holds up.
Most definitely. I think it's got a super distinctive style. It's something where it's clearly benefiting from like the development development of Xerox in particular, because they can do those hatching lines for the shading on the characters that you could not do in animation before then, because then you'd have to do the pencils and then trace over them. Good old iWorks, once again, saving the day. If we didn't have 101 Dalmatians, we'd never have Fritz. But yeah, and the distinctive backgrounds with the tracing photographs they took on a trip to New York and all that, the colors, God. Yeah, no, like, I know on some level I'm just repeating the exact same thing you're saying, but it's like, wow, it still looks really impressive. Yeah, Tim, your thoughts?
I think it definitely holds up. I think it's a good one to look at just like on the scale of like Bakshi's works, because I think it looks different from a lot of them, because a lot of the stuff that he's animated focuses more on like rotoscoping for that kind of hyper realistic kind of look, and this is definitely more of a kind of stylized cartoony kind of look. The way that it kind of blends in with the backgrounds is always interesting. I still haven't seen Heavy Traffic, but from what I've seen of it looks like it has sort of a similar style to that. Overall, I think it has a solid aesthetic to it, and I think it's a good movie.
Agreed.
Movie good.
Movie good. I do have a little bit to say on this too, because it sort of goes back to those production issues, particularly the backgrounds. Because I did mention the audio, and then both the audio and the backgrounds are sort of sourced from the same place, because they went on, they were based out of New York, so they went on trips where they would go around taking photos of all these locations, and they would have the background artist Ira Turek. He would trace them roughly using the exact same pen that Crumb used. It was a type of radiograph pen to sort of replicate his lines. And I like it because it's clearly done freehand, where you can see the little errors and where like his hand was shaking, that sort of thing. It adds a very distinct quality to the animation, combined with like those really vivid watercolor, like sometimes very vivid, sometimes very muddy watercolors used throughout. But another thing they did while they were out was they did record man on the street stuff, like just with random people. That's why like the opening sequence was just people they saw on the street, and they recorded them. They would ask interview questions, that sort of thing. All the crows in the bar before you meet Fritz and Duke, it's the same thing there, where they just actually recorded people. That's a thing that I really love about the dialogue, is people kind of cut people off in a way you don't see in animated films, in a really kind of naturalistic way. It's something he does more in Heavy Traffic, I think, in Coonskin. It's really something that you didn't see, this very urban sort of grungy aesthetic that still aspires to at times be beautiful, which I think it achieves. One of the sequences that jumps out to me is Winston and Fritz leaving the city, in particular, the morphing watercolors as they go out, and the long stretch of homages to various Crumb comics in the form of big neon signs. The way it creates spaces for these characters to exist in that like are kind of liminal, literally, creating liminal spaces as transitions between sequences. Like, I love how experimental and weird the Bo Diddley sequences, where it's just this crow in the foreground snapping its fingers as it slowly zooms in on the scene with like the changing colors on it. Just really interesting ideas, even if they don't coalesce necessarily at times, even if they don't quite land. I just love them. I love them so much. I love seeing animators do cool things with the medium that other people weren't necessarily trying, even if it doesn't quite work. Animation, specifically, I did want to get into. It's obvious that they didn't really have a proper animation director, because there are scenes that are clearly not corrected in any capacity. So you see a lot of stuff where, like, you can tell a certain artist's style, and some of them are particularly rough as a result. They couldn't even do pencil tests, let alone corrections for this. For the most part, it was just flipping through their drawings. Very, very old-fashioned sort of way of going about it, but that's how you make a animated feature for less than $500,000. But sometimes it works. Sometimes they end up with some really good, snappy animation. Again, like Fritz's monologue, a sequence is really stellar character animation you get from him. And then sometimes you get the scene, that really flat scene of the one with the pig cop when he crashes through the window, and it's so soft and squishy, and it looks like crap. I also really like the soundtrack and score by Ed Bogus and Ray Shanklin, and also all the other tracks that included in the soundtrack. They're good. It's good. It's a good soundtrack. I own it on vinyl.
Ooh.
But that's pretty much the aesthetics.
There's this one scene where they're up in the woman's apartment, Fritz and Duke, and they go to like the wide angle lens of them sort of running and being very high, and I was quite impressed by that cut.
Oh yeah, I totally forgot, but yes, I love the stuff they do there. Like, they do a lot of clever things, particularly with crossfades. They do a lot of clever things with crossfades to kind of cover up some of the animation deficiencies at times, but it does add sort of a dreamy quality to it that I really like. And yeah, that particular segment of the Bertha sequence is really good. I mean, the riot sequence is also, I think, really most cohesive in a lot of respects, and it has a lot of good ideas in it, even if some really gratuitous and like grounded animation, like Duke's death aside. There's one of like a pig cop being bowled over and you see their guts fly out. But yeah, that's the animation, that's the aesthetic in a nutshell. It's really neat overall. And I guess that brings us to final thoughts. Tim, start with you.
Yeah, I mean, this is definitely a movie that I've grown to appreciate more the more that I've watched it. And I don't think it's Bakshi's strongest work, but I think it's a solid foundation that led to a lot of really great films from him. It's also just such a great gateway to being able to do more with the medium of animation, and it definitely helps pave the way for a lot of things that I enjoy now.
For sure. Like, its significance, at least, can't be understated, even if some might disagree about its quality. Austin, final thoughts?
To sort of mimic something you guys said earlier, Fritz is like a modern day blockbuster, but instead of like expensive action set pieces, it has these really raunchy bits that try to push the boundaries as far as possible. Just ultimate edgelordery. At the time, some of the selling points was the sex, the drugs, and the violence. And while that sputter spectacle kind of gives the film this unique feeling adult edge, its satirical trappings feel equally daring at times, like pig cops, you know, with their dicks out. And those to me aged a lot better as far as entertainment value goes. Like, if people can stomach some of the gross nonsense that happens, there's some really, really funny bits in here. If you're studying animation, the history of animation, or 60s counterculture, this is a must-watch. Otherwise, I tell some people, like, watch out. It might play just as poorly to the uninitiated as, like, some shorts off the censored 11. You gotta be careful, but if this is what you're looking for, I think more often than not, people are gonna have a good time with this.
For sure. I think you definitely have to prime the pump for it too, because there's a lot of Bakshi history to it. And like, you know, he grew up in a Jewish ghetto as a young man. He went to an all-black school, which offered him relatively more perspective, you know, as the only white guy there, which offered him a bit more perspective. And also the fact that as a general rule, he employed more minorities at his studio, women and black men in particular, but also in 1977, he hired one of the first black women to work in animation, Brenda Banks. She briefly worked at the Warner studio prior, but he had no idea about that. She just walked into his studio and said, I want to make cartoons. And he just looked baffled for a moment and was like, yeah, do some tests and we'll see. And then she did tests for Wizards. She did some of the goon animation for the crowd shots, and he loved it and hired her immediately, and she stayed with the studio until its closure. So like, it can certainly be argued that it's not his place to say these things. Like, he probably should have deferred to others, and he has problems with depicting women, but I think the satirical qualities of the film are not quite as pointed as they are in later films, but they're probably funnier than they are in later films. The gross out stuff is what it is. I can appreciate it as a boundary pushing thing, but it often runs a bit too long. But despite that, I think there's a lot of gold here. And if you want to see what this movie would have looked like if it was like what I think most people's like worst possible interpretation of it is, go watch 9 Lives of Fritz the Cat. That's basically the only merit to that film, is like, it makes you appreciate the original all the more. But the original is pretty darn good and significant and definitely worth a look. And that's it for today. Class, you dismissed. You've done your homework. We did the podcast. No, for all our wonderful listeners out there, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. It boosts us in the algorithm, and it's great. If you want to enjoy an uncensored version, and this is an episode where you might actually want to pursue that a bit more than the others, because there's a lot to censor.
I imagine this one's just going up on YouTube uncensored.
I don't know if it's even going up on Spotify with the black bars removed. I don't know if we could just drop animated nudity on Spotify Spotify like that.
Mostly uncensored then on Spotify video, at least all the curses. Yeah, check out the Spotify video version or the audio version on your podcatcher of choice. Be sure to give it 5 stars, thumbs up, dependent upon whichever your, again, service of choice uses. And be sure to check out our Patreon, where you can help support the great things we do here at the Bomb Squad podcast. We'll do something with it if you give us money. That's the rule. And
fund our first feature film.
Exactly. You'll see it first. You remember the Spoonie movie? We'll be like him. And next week, join the Bomb Squad as we journey into the uncanny valley for Richard Linklater's latest animated feature, Apollo 10.5. Get the fuck off my car.
Oh, is that the ending line? Because that was fucking excellent.
Yeah, that's it. Hard
Very
stop.
well.
They've killed Fritz! They've killed Fritz!
I just slid my ticket across the table and I said, "Sorry guys, I gotta see about a girl."